Blood dripped onto the polished deck from the torn white shirt before Dean's voice died mid-note. The younger man stumbled up the stairwell, holding his chest with both hands, dark stains spreading between his fingers, and 10 seconds behind him. The older man emerged with his hand inside his jacket, pulling out chrome metal that caught the string lights. 70 party guests still laughing with champagne raised. Nobody turning toward the stairs yet. Dean's microphone still live, and picking up the exact moment his breathing stopped. Wait, because when Dean dropped that microphone and walked straight toward the man with the gun, the producer who'd paid him $3,000 for the night, grabbed his wrist hard and hissed, "Don't you dare. These are private business matters." But Dean pulled free and kept walking, and those next 3 minutes cost him one of the most valuable connections in Hollywood. Cost him future work easily worth 6 figures, and the thing almost nobody understood was that Dean saw it coming, the second he made the choice, and walked anyway. The evening had started clean. Robert Langford's yacht sat in the Marina del Rey harbor, with 70 guests on deck, string lights overhead, making everything soft and golden. The Pacific rolling gentle and dark beyond the railings. Langford threw these parties twice a year. Always the same crowd, studio executives, agents, a few actors, the kind of people who made decisions over cocktails and called it networking. Dean had been invited as the entertainment, a favor for an old connection, the kind of gig that paid well and cost nothing but 3 hours and a tuxedo. He'd done 100 of these, sing 4 songs, take some photos, leave before midnight. Easy work, or it was supposed to be, until Dean felt his throat tighten on the second verse and knew something was wrong before he understood what. He'd arrived at 8:30, stepping onto the deck in a dark suit with an open collar, no tie, keeping it relaxed. Langford had met him at the gangway, all smiles and firm handshake, the kind of producer who wore his money in his posture. "Dean, thank you for coming. You're going to love the crowd tonight." Dean had nodded, smiled back, let himself be led to the makeshift stage area near the stern, where a small band waited, piano, bass, drums, the kind of setup that looked casual but cost more than most people's cars. The guests had applauded when Langford introduced him, and Dean had picked up the microphone and started easy. Ain't that a kick in the head first, then sway. The crowd warming up, drinks flowing, and Dean already noticing the 2 men in dark suits who weren't drinking, weren't smiling, weren't there for the music. But there was something under the surface, something Dean noticed in the first 20 minutes and couldn't quite name. Look at a party long enough, and you start to see the currents. Who's avoiding who, who's watching the stairs, who's checking their watch. 2 men had gone below deck around 9 o'clock, both in dark suits, both moving like they had somewhere to be and something to settle. Dean had seen them disappear down the stairwell near the bow, and he'd filed it away the way you file away anything that doesn't quite fit the mood. One of them was younger, maybe 35, with slicked back hair and a nervous energy in his shoulders. The other was older, 50 or so, thicker in the chest, walking like he owned the space under his feet. Dean checked his own watch, 9:05, and figured he had 40 minutes left before he could leave. But something in his gut told him those 2 men would be back up before then, and whatever they were settling below deck wasn't going to stay settled. Dean had started. That's Amore at 9:45. The crowd loved it, always did. The kind of song that made people sway and hum along, even if they didn't know all the words. Remember this moment. The song, the time, the feeling that everything was still smooth. Because Dean would never sing that song the same way again after what happened in the next 60 seconds. He was halfway through the second verse, the band tight behind him, the night warm and easy, when he saw the stairwell door open. The younger man came up first, moving fast, one hand pressed against his chest. His shirt was torn at the collar, and there was something dark spreading across the white fabric, something that caught the string lights wrong. something that made Dean's voice keep going for another 3 seconds on pure muscle memory, while his brain screamed at him to stop, to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd just seen. But his eyes were locked on that shirt, on the way the man's face had gone chalk white and tight with pain, and then his voice just died in his throat mid-word. The older man came up 10 seconds later. He moved slower, deliberate, his hand inside his jacket in a way that made Dean's stomach drop. The guests hadn't noticed yet. They were still talking, laughing. A woman near the railing raising her glass for a toast. But Dean saw it all framing up in slow motion. The younger man backing toward the port side railing. The older man's hand coming out of his jacket with something metal, the distance between them closing. Dean dropped the microphone. It hit the deck with a thud, and a feedback squeal that cut through the music, through the conversation, through everything. The band stuttered to a stop. Heads turned, and in that sudden silence, everybody saw what Dean had already seen. The older man had a gun, small chrome held low at his side, but unmistakable under the party lights. The younger man had his hands up, palms out, blood visible now on his fingers where he'd been pressing his chest. "Frank, don't," the younger man said, voice tight and shaking. "Just listen to me." Dean was already moving, 3 steps off the stage area, 4, 5, his shoes loud on the deck, the crowd pulling back like water. Robert Langford appeared at his elbow, grabbing his arm hard. "Dean, stop. Don't get involved. These are business matters." His voice was low, urgent, the kind of command you give someone when you're used to being obeyed. But Dean shook him off without looking at him and kept walking. Remember something about Dean Martin, the smooth persona, the easy charm, the way he made everything look effortless on stage. That was the performance. Underneath it was something harder, something built in Steubenville, Ohio, where he'd grown up watching his father work in a barber shop and learned early that some things mattered more than keeping your head down. He'd spent his whole career playing the cool guy, the guy who never lost his composure. But there were lines he wouldn't cross, and one of them was watching someone get hurt when he could do something about it. He stopped 6 feet from the 2 men, close enough to matter, far enough to give himself room if things went wrong. The older man, Frank, the younger one had called him, looked at Dean with eyes that were flat and cold. "This doesn't concern you, Martin." "Maybe not," Dean said. His voice was steady, conversational, the same tone he used to introduce songs. "But you're on a deck with 70 people, and you've got a gun in your hand, so I'm making it concern me." Frank didn't move. The gun stayed at his side, not raised but present. A promise. The younger man was breathing hard, sweat on his forehead, mixing with the blood on his collar. "Vincent here made some poor decisions," Frank said. "Cost us both a lot of money. We're just settling accounts." "Looks like you already settled them," Dean said, nodding at the blood. "So how about you put that away and we all go home?" There was a moment, one of those stretched seconds where everything could tip either way, where Frank's hand tensed on the gun and Dean saw him calculating. 70 witnesses, a celebrity standing between them. The attention this would draw if it went any further. Dean kept his eyes on Frank's face, not the gun, the way you do when you need someone to see you as a person and not an obstacle. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel sweat starting to bead on his neck despite the cool ocean air, could taste copper in his mouth, the way you do when adrenaline floods your system. But his voice stayed steady. Vincent broke the silence. "Dean, please. He's going to kill me. He told me downstairs." His voice cracked, and he took a step sideways along the railing, trying to create distance. Frank's hand came up, not pointing the gun yet, just lifting it, and the crowd gasped as one. Dean moved without thinking, stepping between them, his back to Frank, facing Vincent. "Hey," he said quietly, just to Vincent. "Look at me. You're okay. We're going to walk away from this." Understand what that meant. Picture it from above. Dean Martin, famous crooner, 3 feet from a man with a loaded gun, his back completely exposed, 70 witnesses watching. Any one of them could have stopped him before he got this far. But nobody did, because nobody expected someone like Dean to do something this stupid. Dean had just put himself between a man with a gun and his target, had made himself the obstacle, the thing that would need to be moved or moved through. It was the kind of stupid instinctive move that gets people hurt or worse, the kind of thing you do when your brain stops calculating odds and just acts. He could feel Frank behind him, could feel the weight of that gun pointed at his back or his head or wherever it was pointed, could feel 70 pairs of eyes locked on this moment. Dean. Frank's voice was tight now, losing the cold control. Dean didn't move. He kept his eyes on Vincent, kept his voice low and steady. You've got about 30 seconds before someone on shore calls the harbor patrol. The marina office can see this deck. You really want to be holding that gun when they show up. It was a bluff. The marina office was 100 yards away, and Dean had no idea if anyone was watching. But it landed. He heard Frank's breathing change, heard the hesitation. Dean pressed forward, voice still calm. Sheriff's department is 3 minutes out, Frank. Maybe 4 if we're lucky. That's not enough time to finish this. Vincent was crying now, silent tears mixing with the sweat, his hands still up, his chest still bleeding. The wound didn't look deep. Probably a knife. Probably not life-threatening if he got help soon. But it was enough to make everything real, enough to make every second count. Frank, put it down. Robert Langford's voice came from somewhere behind Dean, strained and desperate. This is my boat. You put it down now, or I call the police myself. Another stretched second. Then Dean heard the click of metal on wood. Frank setting the gun down on a deck chair. The tension broke like a snapped wire. People exhaled. Someone started crying. Dean turned slowly, keeping himself between Vincent and Frank, and saw Frank standing there with empty hands raised, his face twisted with rage and something else, something that looked almost like relief. The whole thing, from the moment Dean dropped the microphone to the moment Frank put down the gun, had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an hour, felt like a lifetime compressed into the space between heartbeats. 2 of Langford's crew moved in fast. Big guys in white uniforms who'd probably been waiting for a signal, and they stepped between Frank and Vincent, while a third went to help Vincent sit down. Dean backed away, his legs shaking now that it was over, adrenaline catching up. His hands were trembling. He shoved them in his pockets. Langford was beside him immediately, face red, voice low and furious. What the hell were you thinking? You could have gotten yourself killed. You could have gotten my guests killed. This was not your business, Dean. Dean looked at him, at the man who'd hired him to sing 4 songs and stay out of trouble, at the man who'd just watched someone pull a gun on his deck and told Dean not to get involved. Yeah, Dean said. I know. He walked back to the stage area, picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd left it, and headed for the gangway. Nobody stopped him. The party was over anyway. Guests were already moving toward the exit, voices shrill with shock and excitement, the kind of story they'd tell at lunch for the next 6 months. Dean didn't look back. He stepped off the yacht onto the dock and kept walking, his shoes loud on the wooden planks, the night air cool on his face. Notice something here. Dean wasn't shaking from fear. His hands were steady on the walk back, his breathing even, his steps deliberate. The trembling would come later, alone in his car, when his body finally understood what his brain had decided in that split second on the deck. Right now, he was just walking, just moving forward, because stopping meant thinking about what he'd just done, and thinking about it meant questioning it, and he wasn't ready for that yet. It was only later, sitting in his car in the marina parking lot, with his hands finally shaking, that Dean thought about what Vincent had said. He told me downstairs. Told him what? That he was going to kill him? Over money. Over a business deal gone wrong. Dean would never know the full story, and that was what made his hands shake. Not the gun, not Frank's cold eyes, but the realization that he'd put himself between a bullet and a man whose name he didn't even know until tonight, whose story he'd never fully understand, whose life he'd maybe saved without knowing if that life deserved saving. Vincent had been taken to the hospital with a stab wound to the upper chest, non-fatal but serious. Frank had been questioned by the harbor patrol and released. No shots fired, no charges pressed, both men claiming it was a misunderstanding. Langford had made it all go away the way powerful men do, with lawyers and quiet conversations and money changing hands in places nobody could see. But Dean knew one thing for certain. He would never work for Robert Langford again. The producer had made that clear 3 days later with a terse phone call. "You embarrassed me in front of my guests. You made a private matter public. I can't have that. We're done." No anger in his voice, just cold finality. And Dean had said okay and hung up. And that was that. Except Dean noticed his hand wasn't shaking when he put the phone down, and he poured himself a drink, not to forget what happened, but to remember why it mattered. Some people asked him later why he did it, why he walked toward the gun instead of away from it, why he put himself between two men he didn't know, over a dispute he didn't understand, why he threw away a lucrative connection for a stranger bleeding on a deck. Dean didn't have a good answer. He'd say something like, "Seemed like the thing to do," or couldn't just stand there and shrug it off, because trying to explain it made it sound more noble than it was. It wasn't noble, it was just instinct. It was seeing someone about to get hurt and deciding that mattered more than anything else in that moment. And if that made him difficult to work with in Hollywood, if that made producers think twice before inviting him, then maybe he was working for the wrong producers. The story spread quietly through Hollywood, the way these things do. Most people heard the sanitized version. Dean Martin had stopped a fight at a yacht party. Very dramatic, very Dean. But a few people knew the real details, knew about the gun and the blood and the choice Dean made. Those were the people who looked at him differently afterward. Some with more respect, some with confusion, like they couldn't square the smooth crooner persona with the guy who stepped between a gunman and his target. Listen to what that meant for Dean's career. The story created two camps in Hollywood, those who thought he was a hero and those who thought he was a liability. Producers started asking themselves, if Dean Martin sees something go wrong on my set, at my party, in my business, will he stay quiet or will he make it public? Will he protect my interests or will he follow his conscience? For some, that question made him more valuable. For others, it made him dangerous. And Dean never bothered to clarify which side he fell on, because the answer was simple: he'd do it again. Dean never sang at another one of Langford's parties. The producer moved on, found other entertainment, built other connections. They saw each other occasionally at industry events over the years. Always polite, always distant, the kind of cordial nod between people who used to know each other. Neither of them ever mentioned that night again, but every time they passed each other in a studio hallway or at a premiere, Dean could see it in Langford's eyes. The question the producer never asked, would you do it again? Vincent recovered and left Los Angeles. 6 months later, Dean heard through a friend of a friend that he'd moved to San Francisco, started over in some other business, stayed out of trouble. They never spoke. Frank stayed in LA, stayed in whatever business had brought him onto that yacht, stayed out of Dean's orbit. That was fine with Dean, or it would have been, if Frank hadn't sent that envelope 6 months later to Dean's dressing room in Vegas. But that's a different story, and one Dean never told anyone about. What stayed with Dean was the weight of those 3 minutes, the sound the microphone made, hitting the deck, the look on Vincent's face when he realized someone was going to help him, the feel of standing with his back to a gun, knowing it could end badly, doing it anyway. He didn't talk about it much, didn't need to. It was just something that happened, something he lived with. One more night in a long career of nights. But here's what most people don't know about that night. It changed how Dean heard his own voice. Listen to his recordings before and after 1964, and you'll hear something different in the way he holds certain notes, the way he pauses before the big finish. That wasn't technique. That was memory. That was 3 minutes on a yacht deck, teaching him that some performances cost more than others. But sometimes, years later, he'd be on stage somewhere, Vegas, New York, some festival or another, and he'd start singing, "That's Amore," and for just a second, he'd be back on that yacht deck, watching the stairwell door, seeing the blood spread across white fabric, and he'd have to close his eyes and push through to the next verse, push past the memory, remind himself he made the right call even if it cost him something. Because that's the thing about doing the right thing. It doesn't always pay off. It doesn't always make sense. Sometimes it costs you relationships and money and opportunities, and you still have to do it because the alternative is living with the knowledge that you could have acted and didn't. Dean understood that. He'd understood it his whole life. It's just that most nights, he didn't have to prove it in front of 70 witnesses with a gun at his back. The night he left that yacht, he drove home slowly, windows down, letting the cool air clear his head. He thought about calling someone, a friend, his manager, someone who'd understand, but he didn't. He just drove and thought, and eventually parked in his driveway and sat there for a while in the dark, hands finally steady, breathing finally even. Then he went inside, poured himself a drink, and tried to forget the look on Vincent's face when he'd realized someone was willing to stand between him and Frank. Tried and failed, because that look would stay with Dean for the rest of his life. A reminder that sometimes the most important performances happen when nobody's expecting one. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. And if you want to know what really happened 6 months later when Frank showed up at Dean's Vegas show with an envelope, tell me in the comments. Some stories don't end clean, and this one had a second act nobody saw coming.